because it's just too dangerous. Then there wasn't the distinction between al-Qaeda and the other insurgent groups was pretty woolly.
Mm-hmm.
So, it varies. And then in other parts south of Baghdad, you have areas there were guys who were guns for hire, Iraq is short on jobs. They worked for al-Qaeda when they were paid by al-Qaeda. They worked for the U.S. when they're paid by the U.S. Somehow when this is sort of reported on television in the U.S., it looks as though, everybody, you have al-Qaeda in that corner, you have other insurgents in another corner, you have good guys who belong to concerned citizens, they're called. But, this was a name invented by the U.S. It's, the Awakening Councils in another corner. But actually they're much more mixed up than it's normally reported.
So when the American media says al-Qaeda in Iraq, we would be too particular to think that what they mean is this group of religiously motivated, probably foreign pilgrims from Saudi Arabia or Egypt, or that any Iraqis who would be members of that would be under them and their authority. Would that even be a correct assumption at all?
Well, this was always exaggerated. Al-Qaeda in Iraq was always had a limited connection to Osama bin Laden, and it's mostly homegrown. It got foreign money. It had some foreign volunteers, above all the suicide bombers. It's pretty difficult for a non-Iraqi to operate in Iraq. He doesn't speak the right kind of Arabic. He doesn't have connections there. So, yeah, there are links with outside, particularly with Saudi Arabia and so forth, where a lot of the suicide bombers come from. It's mostly a homegrown organization. I think overall, one can talk about all the details of, these different elements in Iraq, but I always keep in mind something that actually a British military intelligence officer had been in Basra, spoke fluent Arabic, and he was saying to me, he said, when we came in, we used to be kind of pretty patronizing to the Americans and say, well, we know about counterinsurgency because of Northern Ireland and Malaya. He said, but in fact, he said, Basra is 100% different from those, because he said we got no allies locally, we got no real friends. He said in Northern Ireland, we were essentially fighting the Catholics, we were supported by the Protestants. In Malaya, there was an insurgency, it was mostly Chinese, the Malays mostly supported the British. But he said, Basra, we've got no allies, we've got no friends. That's the main political fact. And it's sort of true for the U.S. in Baghdad, too.
He's including the Badr Corps in that.
Sure, yeah. None of these people really like foreign occupation. And you can tell the attitude, if you're in a room, Americans or British are there with Iraqis. Even Iraqis in the Green Zone, as soon as the Americans or British are left, the conversation really changes. They start criticizing them and so forth. I'd say it's a little difficult in Kurdistan, where the Kurds look to the Americans as a sort of guarantee of their semi-independence. But Kurdistan is not occupied. There are pretty well no American troops up there.
Mm-hmm. Well, if I had an I Dream of Jeannie here and I could make her get all the American troops out of Iraq by yesterday, what do you think would happen?
Well, I think, this is the only road to peace, ultimately. The American presence there, I remember when it first happened, I said to people, look, I think, the American occupation is basically what generates the violence here. People say, well, Americans and some Iraqis say, well, if Americans left, there'd be an explosion, there'll be sectarian civil wars. But Americans stayed, and we essentially had that. We had, tens of thousands of people slaughtered. There's some, you could say, do they have any positive role, in policing? Well, limited. But it's also, that's one of the American presence is one of the main factors generating violence. And so long as it is there, it'll be resisted. Some stage that, Senator McCain was saying that the U.S. will simply win a victory. This is not in the cards. This is a recipe for more violence, for more insurgency, for more resistance from all the Iraqi Arab communities.
You mentioned the tens of thousands who were slaughtered in the Civil War, and for those of us on the outside, we see all these different numbers ranging from a few tens of thousands of Iraqis killed this whole time to 100,000 to 700,000 to over 1 million. Which of these studies seems to ring true to you, Patrick?
I think it's hundreds of thousands. I don't really know any Iraqi family that hasn't lost somebody, because they were kidnapped, lost somebody because they were caught in a firefight, lost somebody because a sniper shot them, or a bomb went off, or they were a helicopter attacked their car. I think it's in the hundreds of thousands. How many hundreds of thousands, I'm not sure. But, those who, surveys which only sort of mention those when the casualties have been reported in the newspapers, this is a great underestimate. And one can see that in the way, that every so often pits are found, with 30, 50 bodies in them, dumped there a few months or 12 months earlier, and nobody knew they were there. So the casualties are very high.
Mm-hmm. Could you comment on the proportion? I don't expect, an exact percentage, but roughly ballpark estimate of the proportion of Iraqis who have been killed by American soldiers doing their house-to-house searches and their counterinsurgency versus the sectarian war between the Mahdi army and al-Qaeda in Iraq from a couple years back, especially?
I don't know the exact figure. I don't even know an approximate figure. But, you can see by the terror that's created, there are still over 2 million Iraqis who've fled to Jordan and Syria. These people are not having a happy time. If they thought all this sort of propaganda we've had about the success of the search, these people would love to come home if they thought they could preserve their lives.
Mm-hmm.
But the real verdict of what's happening is that these people are staying, often bankrupt, families crowded together in one single room in Damascus, girls forced into prostitution to feed their families. That's the real verdict in what's been happening, and the overall lack of success. Otherwise these people wouldn't stay abroad. They'd come home.
Patrick Cockburn, Middle East correspondent for the London Independent. I can't tell you how much I appreciate you coming on the show today. I also want to tell you what a great time I had hanging out with your brother Alex at the Future Freedom Conference this last weekend. He's a really great guy.
Thank you.
And if it's possible, I'd like to ask you if you could just perhaps comment briefly on the situation in the Gaza Strip, what Americans might need to know about that, just in brief.
Well, I was in a literary festival in England 2 or 3 weeks ago, and we had a briefing from President Jimmy Carter, who had just come from Gaza, and he said, so far as he was concerned, one of the great human rights crimes on the face of the planet at the moment was the siege of Gaza. What was happening to the people there? This is cut off like any siege. People just don't suffer; they die. And who dies first? It's small baby, it's old people. And they die obscurely. It isn't people expiring in the middle of the street. So this is a tremendous crime, is which is happening, and which is ignored by the rest of the world. Tony Blair is meant to be has a role there as a sort of mediator. He never goes to Gaza. This is ignored.
And it is basically just a total blockade on all trade in and out of the Gaza Strip. Is that right?
Yeah, most of the trade is stopped. Almost everything is stopped. It's people are on the edge of starvation, maybe over the edge of starvation. This is a crime, and it's a crime for which the world will probably pay. That the failure of America to do anything about it, the failure of Europe to do anything about it, the failure of the Arab states to do anything about it. This does not make you friends on the streets of the Middle East, and certainly not on the streets of Gaza.
Something that we always need to take into account, the obvious consequences and the unforeseen consequences that no one will be able to predict.
Yeah, you see, everybody forgets now sanctions on Iraq in the 1990s, but this destroyed the Iraqi economy, it's destroyed Iraqi society, the currency became worthless, population was generally unemployed,